business news from the Capital Region. This is Washington Business Report with ABC7 national correspondent Rebecca Cooper.
Welcome to this week's look at business news that matters here in the Washington region. Coming up, it's countdown to the April 1st primary. The race heats up to see who will be the next mayor of what's often dubbed the most powerful city in the world. We have profiles of two of the top candidates running. But first, a look at the other big headlines this week in business news.
This week, not waiting for answers, insurance giant Allianz started paying claims on missing Malaysian Flight 370. Toyota will pay big, $1.2 billion, as it joins GM in the club of car makers accused this week of hiding design defects to avoid bad PR at the cost of drivers' lives.
Put simply, Toyota's conduct was shameful.
No shame shown by Vladimir Putin. His response to U.S. freezing assets as Russia claims Crimea, Russian sanctions on U.S. lawmakers, including House Speaker John Boehner, who says he's okay giving up family travel to Siberia this summer. Meantime, Janet Yellen rattled markets when she said to reporters she estimates only about 6 months before the Fed eases efforts on holding down interest rates. But the market quickly bounced back thanks to better than expected manufacturing numbers on Thursday. Big leadership changes in Washington. Nikki Gorin taking over for Julie Rogers at the Meyer Foundation. Created in 1944 by the owners of the Washington Post, the foundation gives big to numerous Washington causes. Under Rogers, the $50 million endowment grew to $210 million. And it was a good week to ask where to go for good food. Rammy nominees were announced for the best places in Washington to eat, drink, and enjoy that expense account if you've got one.
And later in the show, we'll talk about the annual Rammy foodie fight over who's the best in the Washington area. But first up this week, let's talk your finances and how Fed movement may impact the economy, plus a look at some of the other top headlines. Joining us today, Jonathan Aberman, founder of Amplifier Ventures and host of Left Jab Radio, and Peter Morici, professor of economics at the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Jonathan, explain to me why Allianz would start paying out on a missing jetliner that hasn't even been found yet.
They have to. Well, as a matter of law and international convention, when something like this happens, there's an immediate requirement to pay the family something to help them with bereavement. Then there's going to be another amount that's going to be paid pretty soon based upon just strict liability when airplanes crash. And then after that, it's going to be a function of how big the claims are and who's at fault and this is negligence. The real issue here is going to be whether or not there was terrorism involved. If there was terrorism involved, the insurance companies could be looking at big claims. So it's about $2.3 billion paid out as a result of 9/11 crashes, for example.
Peter, something we may never know.
Absolutely. We certainly aren't going to know. It's at this far out in time, it's highly unlikely. I watched the movie The Hindenburg this week, and it reminded me
There's
very
an
much.
uplifting film.
Well, exactly. This is going to be one of those mysteries. There's 4 or 5 different explanations of the Hindenburg, and they'll be the same for this.
Okay, let's explain another mystery, and that is what will the Fed do and why does it matter? You heard Janet Yellen this week being pressed by reporters. Give us a timeline on when the Fed will stop keeping interest rates artificially low. She finally said, okay, about 6 months. The market hated that answer. And then the next day bounced back, investors saying, you know what, that was computer training. Now that we take a look at it and we look at some of these other good numbers, we're not so worried.
Well, she was asked what a long period of time would be. It's another word. And she said, well, a lot of things go into that because we're looking at a lot of variables. It could be 6 months, and they grabbed it to mean, well, she's going to do it in 6 months, which is absurd. You know,
the media being impatient. Can you imagine?
Exactly. Well, traders being impatient because they want certainty, and the poor woman can't give them that. In fact, the statement said they couldn't give them certainty. I don't think we're looking at higher interest rates until, on the short rate until at least April, May, June of next year.
Jonathan, your take.
I agree. I think that the United States economy is much stronger and more relevant than everybody thinks it is. Secondarily, I think it's really sad we're in a financial world where we watch the Fed the way we watched the smoke coming out of the Vatican to see what happens. But to my mind, the big story here is that we have a market that is driven by addiction to liquidity, and we have fundamental issues with our fiscal situation. And I'm watching, I'm sure Peter is, China very closely. We may be looking at the possibility of a rerun of 2007, except this time involving Chinese real estate market.
Ease up. China's sitting on $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. That's the government. They can literally bail out every bank in the country, unlike, say, Iceland or Ireland or what have you.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
It's a whole different game. We just don't know. Institutionally, China's so different how that's going to play out.
And our bank's actually getting a good grade on
Yeah.
Friday, the stress test. They're saying all but one major bank actually has enough capital to live through
I
another.
disappointed some producers and gave up the opportunity to go on cable. They called me up and I said,
Why would
"Listen,
you give up that?
I
Why
said,
would you
"This-
take that when
he
you
was
got
Hold
it?
busy.
on. I said, there's nothing here. I said, they passed the stress test. Why? Because Ben gave them a good test. Now, you got to remember, a stress
That's
test
right.
is not the real world. It's a flight simulator.
That's right.
But it's very different than European stress tests where they can't have all the failures in one country and this and that. I mean, they grade on a curve. It's community college grading over. Excuse me.
Jonathan, last word on the banks.
Highly concentrated banking system, much more concentrated than it's ever been. But because it's concentrated and because there's cheap money, a lot of them are in good shape right now. I just wish they lent more.
The smart money listens to you too, and so do I. Thanks for joining us. And stay tuned. Up next, the man who says he'd be the best CEO for this city, talking $14 billion deals and more. Find out who it is when we return.